Property has been an obsession for Chinese. And part of the reason is that if you look at the financial system, what can you invest in? If you have some money, stack it under your mattress is one, putting in banks and earning a zero real rate of return is another, or putting into the roller coaster stock market, which haven't really paid off. So there are not a lot of choices. So even as an investment, property has been very popular for Chinese households. Now, in places like Shanghai, the demand is so high that you'll have these kind of very creative ways, and by the way, not surprising at all, to deal with and to circumvent these restrictions. And we have to understand there are
Sorry, the restrictions being what?
Being that you're not eligible to purchase a second house unless you meet certain criteria. Okay. So divorce was one of the possibilities, but there are also all kinds of rules that I can't keep track of. But we have to understand there's a big heterogeneity throughout within China. The first and second tier cities, which do show, the first tier cities show evidence of a property bubble, whereas for the rest of the country, there is no evidence of property bubble because the growth of property prices has been roughly in line with household income growth. And so for many third, fourth tier cities, the price can still keep on going up.
Yeah, but in Shanghai, Beijing, etc., the prices are, at least by Western standards, kind of out of whack with income.
Well, no, we have to think about it in this way. Housing price is an expectations of the future.
Right.
If you believe Beijing and Shanghai is going to be a cosmopolitan global city of the likes of New York and Tokyo, then high prices show up today. So it could also reflect highly optimistic views about the future. And now you can say that is no longer rationalized, so there will be an adjustment. But for a long period of time, they were looking forward. And by the way, there are a lot of really wealthy Chinese people all around. So
yeah, I mean, again, you talked about how the younger generation have certain parallels with the issues that young people in the West have, and you must have a view on both because you teach at the LSE, so you know lots of kind of Western students, but you also teach in Beijing and so on. Is there the same sense amongst the Chinese young that the system isn't working for them anymore, or rather that if you're a member of the elite, if you've already got money or if you've got connections, you'll be okay. But if you're not, you're kind of looking from the outside in. I mean, I remember when I was in Beijing at one point talking to a student at Tsinghua. He made it, but he was from a small city. And he said, there's so many kids in my class from a few schools in Beijing. From my city, maybe one person got to this university. And it reminded me of the kind of laments you get here in Britain about, the sort of the rich still dominate universities, or Harvard legacy students. Do you see a parallel there?
Meritocracy has always been the bedrock of society, Chinese society, especially in the last 40 years. There's an argument to be made that there's somewhat of an erosion of meritocracy, which I find to be very frustrating and a big challenge to China. But still, until very recently, if you look at the surveys, the expectations of the young is still pretty rosy in China. Big contrast to the younger generation around the world. It was only during the pandemic where many of the university students felt extremely frustrated. I think that some of that sentiment has changed. But there is not the sense that the system isn't working for them. It's whether the economy can recover enough, that there will be confidence, that there will be jobs. And yes, there's a greater frustration with the circumstances, but these young people look at what's happening outside of China. They look and they are not inspired. They look at what's happening with democracies, what's happening with the random police shootings in the U.S., or the democracies that have been transposed onto foreign soil in various parts of the world. They look at the chaos in Hong Kong. They're not inspired. They don't think that there's an alternative of a better model. And that shows in the surveys. In surveys, they ask the younger generation whether China would be suited for a different and alternative model. And the majority of them do not believe so, even though they admit that there are huge challenges for the Chinese system.
I was actually kind of had an open question about those figures you cite, because you say that 38% of young Chinese say that a Western political model would not be suitable for China. But that leaves open the possibility that the other sort of 2/3 might think it was suitable.
The sentiment towards the West changed in 2017. So I'd say that before 2017, many of them were quite attracted by different forms of political systems, at least as a possibility for China, and looking at the West. But things did take a dramatic move in 2017.
What happened then?
Trump as an example, and of course with the rising tensions of U.S.-China.
But
Now,
of course, 2017 is also the year that Xi amends the constitution and extends his period in power. So that could also cause a few question marks. Yeah.
but that's the time when the Western perceptions, in particular, have
Shifted, definitely.
shifted for the negative. We just have to understand that there's superficial globalization. The fact that we like Hollywood and NBA, et cetera, that
Carry
is
the same
very
phones.
very appealing for the young Chinese. But their cultural roots are overwhelmingly local. As I show in my book, the statistics, 80% of the students from 2013 have returned to China, not only because it's close to home, because they have good Chinese food, of course, that's important, but also because of the opportunities that are afforded them, the entrepreneurial spirit, the fact that people had great jobs in Google and Facebook also opt to go back to China to make their life, and the fact that they're creating their homegrown kind of culture, modern culture, cosmopolitan culture, so vibrant in the second-tier cities. So they are fostering a different environment there.
Yeah, I mean, how has the pandemic and the handling of the pandemic affected the relationship between people and the government? Because you mentioned it ended very suddenly when there were young people demonstrating, and that was quite striking that the government shifted so quickly. What do you make of that episode? A lot more than an episode, a couple of years.
I was reassured that when there was concerted pressure from the younger generation, but also from the people, potentially even the local governments, that such a long-term kind of or steadfast policy was broken. It shows that there are mechanisms. This is a very important point, that there are mechanisms embedded in the systems, whether it's from the people and social media or the competitive mechanism within the Chinese government, that makes it so that preferences are still revealed and potentially shape the outcomes of political and economic decisions. Now, of course, that is the ongoing challenge as the Chinese government has to manage a much more complex society going forward. Not like the time when I was born and everybody was content with having a growing income. Today, it's increasingly complex. But this new generation, young generation, overturning a key policy was more positive for me. But we also forget.
But you said the preferences revealed. I mean, they were revealed by people demonstrating on the streets. It wasn't a particularly sophisticated polling exercise.
Absolutely, but it's a two-way monitoring system, and social media creates that kind of platform, not only for the Chinese government to watch what was happening on the ground, but other way as well. And I think that basically the complex. Well, anyway, let me start over. I think the complexity of the society is a big challenge for the Chinese government, and they do listen. They do listen. Now, I still think the ongoing challenge is how do you have the political mechanism to include the much more important participants of the economy, like the private businessman, the entrepreneur, in that system. If they don't do it and they don't adapt, the system is not going to be as powerful or will enable the Chinese dreams, aspirations that it has laid out.
Yeah, and you use the phrase "the Chinese dream." It's one that Xi Jinping uses, and he talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people. But I know some economists worry that Xi is so statist, or as they see it, that he's in danger of killing that entrepreneurial spirit. And they point particularly to the fate of Jack Ma, who was the icon of Chinese business, appeared to say something or do something the government didn't like, and is now, as far as we know, sort of teaching students in Tokyo.
He's called back now.
Oh, really? Is he? Well, yeah. Well, tell me
Yes.
first what you made of that episode, but also more broadly what it said about the government's relationship with the most dynamic business elements in society.
Well, the first thing to note is, broadly speaking, there can be a coexistence of seemingly paradoxical and irreconcilable things in China. That's something that perhaps a Western audience ought to keep in mind, and that no policy is permanent and they're constantly being fine-tuned. So the pretext of this is under the umbrella of common prosperity under President Xi, how to achieve equitable growth. But I think perhaps what the audience can relate to is that in Xi's view, China doesn't want to be like the U.S., a high growth, a great economy, but highly inequitable, and politics sing to the tunes of corporates. China wants an olive-shaped income distribution, narrow on the ends and fat in the middle. It wants the corporates to sing to the tunes of politics. And so this initial dramatic sweeping regulatory clampdowns and technology companies that had consequences for personalities and private businessmen such as Jack Ma was, of course, a devastating blow to the economy because of the confidence issue. However,
Did it wipe $1 trillion off the stock exchange?
Yes, it did,
That's
because
extraordinary figure.
because of American investors couldn't make what was going to happen to the private entrepreneurs. And that's all very understandable. Now, that's a painful lesson for the Chinese government, understanding that whatever they say, their intentions, their ambitions have real economic and immediate capital markets consequences. That was not the case in the old playbook, which was economy built on industrialization. In the new playbook around innovation and encouragement of entrepreneurs, they have to have credibility and commitment, something the Western government struggled with for a long period of time to learn. Now is the learning process for the Chinese government. However, that said, now you see that in the recent past, in the recent last few months, the state has rolled back some of these heavy blows, invited Jack Ma to come back, and there's a lot of luring private businessmen and trying to restore that confidence because guess what? Today's China's economy, the private sector is firmly in the driver's seat and they do the heavy lifting of the economy, unlike during the financial crisis of 2009, they call on Team China, state banks flush with cash, and state-owned enterprises splurging on infrastructure, and you get the economy back going. That no longer works. So even if the West believes that there's a statist approach of President Xi and control on the SOEs, the reality is that pretty much everything about the economy is driven by the private sector, and the government is keenly aware of that.
Yeah, and obviously now both the development of the economy, but also this emerging struggle between the US and China that we started on, technology is absolutely key to it. And how and there's a debate. Some in the US say, China, because it's not as open a society as us, is not going to be able to advance as rapidly technologically. Others say, well, look at mobile payments, for example, where China was way ahead. And that China will, in fact, surprise, if you like, liberal theorists and prove that you can have rapid technological advance in a one-party state. What do you think is happening? I mean, just on the ground, as you observe these various sort of groundbreaking technologies, if there is a race between China and America, who's ahead?
I think that we ought to be a little bit more nuanced when you talk about technology, which is a very broad concept. China is very strong on innovations around business models and applications, and frankly, coming up with practical solutions to real problems. By the way, developing countries, their biggest problem is not that they don't have access to the most advanced technologies, but they don't have access to technologies they can actually use. And these would be Chinese technologies, more suitable for them, for 80% of the global population, than American technology. So I believe that
because they're cheaper or simpler to use?
Because they're cheaper, reliable quality, all that access, and that they solve practical problems. So they're more user-friendly for developing countries.
Well, give me a couple of practical examples.
For instance, solar panels or, the renewables is a very good example. EVs will be a very prominent example. Remember that the technology, controversial technology, forced technology transfers, if you will, didn't make China leap ahead in traditional automotives, but it's often in greenfield technologies where China has spearhead, and EVs is one of such examples. But even
in fact, I read in the Financial Times, no less, that next year China will become the world's largest exporter of cars.
China has became the largest consumer and producer of EVs within a decade, not least thanks to the government rolling out 4 million chargers around the country, as opposed to 140,000 in the U.S. So talk about, and the state coordinating supply chains around these EV companies. So that comes back to the point about technology, right? Yes, the U.S. is putting out a bunch of, aggressive policies to try to hobble China's technological growth, but we have to remember, China has an all-encompassing innovation ecosystem within the country. There's close proximity between the downstream players like EVs, autonomous vehicles, and artificial intelligence companies with chip companies. They're close close proximity means that their demand will drive these innovation efforts. And we have to remember that there are a lot of unexpected consequences of American policies because that just gives a huge boost to the domestic industry. So it's much more complex than saying US-China technology competition and decoupling.
And I mean, one thing that everybody's been waiting for is the moment at which China becomes the world's largest economy. I think in purchasing power, it happened actually in 2014. But even when that happens, it will still, on a per capita basis, be much poorer than the United States or Western Europe. And you write quite a lot in the book about can they make this leap from a $10,000 per person economy to a $30,000 per person economy, and that will be very difficult. I mean, are you confident it'll happen?
Well, that's the hard part. The catching up growth. I don't want to underestimate, this remarkable economic success story. But catching up is much easier than becoming a rich country. And to become the $30,000 income per capita nation, you need innovation because productivity growth is the only sustainable source of economic growth. And lots need to change. For instance, institutions needs to be better. The financial system, which supports innovative companies, needs to totally reform. They are the last old dinosaur in the Chinese economy. Why? Because the Chinese state likes control. They don't want to cede control. And they want to protect retail investors. But the longer they protect, the longer it will take for them to learn. And you can never get a dynamic, vibrant financial system. Of course, with all the problems in the U.S., I would still argue that it's one of the key critical contributors to U.S.'s innovation system. And then, of course, as we were mentioning, how do you get a wider, diverse set of preferences from businessmen to students to people to be reflected on the top? All of that is really important. It's easier to copy goods, but it's very difficult to copy good institutions.
Talking of which, I mean, as I referred to earlier, Xi is now entering his third term, and as some Chinese liberal put it to me, it's not the third term that worries me, it's the fourth, it's the fifth. Do you think that Chinese institutions have this flexibility that you think they need?
Political reforms have lagged economic reforms. I'm not saying that there has been none. There have been, but it's significantly slower and much less visible. I think it is a big challenge. I think the system has always been able to adapt to the evolution of society and the economy, even in the last 40 years. More competition, more checks and balances. Of course, it's taken a few steps back in the recent years. And I do think it's a big challenge. But with today, I mean, at least for the short term, let's just hope that the fact that Xi's inner circle are loyalists means that there's going to be more trust in the inner circle and that there will be more delegation, at least in terms of practical issues like the economy, to the experts and to the technocrats and to trust them.
Yeah. And since there has just been a reshuffle, a lot of these names won't be familiar to people in the West, but who are the key people in the inner circle who'll be driving things like economic reform?
Well, I would say that Li Qiang, the premier, is the most important figure. And we have to remember, all of these standing committee members, Politburo members, have all been deep, profound beneficiaries of reform and opening up. And they're not going to forget that. That's what changed their personal lives. And Li Qiang's background is also very interesting because he rose to the top by helping private businessmen succeed. And he had made famous speeches even when he was more lowly, on lowly municipal levels of, if you guys have great ideas, come to me. We're all going to support them. And he thoroughly understands the deep frustrations and challenges that face private businessmen. So he has made it clear that he wants to support them. And by the way, when he was Shanghai mayor, that's when Tesla also moved their factories there. And he was very encouraging of these foreign businesses. So I think we have an eminently practical and sensible person in charge of the economy.
Okay, well, we've talked a lot about the things that made China's growth and this economic miracle, I think you can say, take place over the last 40 years. And you mentioned things that were crucial, innovation, the private sector and so on. But I guess one thing that was really crucial was peace, that this has been a long, China hasn't been at war since 1979. But now, I think, certainly in Washington, it's quite striking and alarming how many people openly talk about the possibility of a war with China. I haven't been to Beijing since the pandemic, but people tell me the mood is quite nationalistic there. Um, just to finish on a depressing note, but how, as somebody again who knows both societies very well, are you concerned about this prospect of war and of a sort of mirroring nationalism? Because people say that the rising generation of Chinese, you say they're more confident, but that some say they're also pretty nationalistic, and that's reflected at the top levels of government, and there's a potential for a clash.
I think the whole world is becoming more nationalistic, including in the US and many countries in the round world, and that is deeply worrying. You mentioned something that's absolutely correct. That's deep in the Chinese people's heart, even today, and especially leaders, and it is peace. The cost of war is still very fresh in the memory. China has not fought a war for decades, as you mentioned. So even on this very timely issue, the critical issue of today of Taiwan, we can't forget that, well, they haven't had the experience of these military confrontations. And so peace is still very much at the core of the leadership's top agenda. They understand that for China to reach the aspirations, including President Xi's aspirations, which is, by the way, most important, making the Chinese economy the biggest in the world, requires peace. And nobody is going to forget that. However, I think that errors in judgment, miscalculations are increasingly more likely. And
On both sides?
On both sides. And one cannot tell where the escalation is coming from. It's interactive, it's dynamic, it's endogenous. And the risk of a miscalculation is real. And I think both sides understand that. But what we do see is that when the temperature has been too hot for both sides, the presidents have respectfully tried to cool it down. I think maybe there's a view in China that left to the parties across the Taiwan Strait, there's more possibility of working out a solution, a peaceful solution. But the military conflict is really the very last resort that China would want to see.